I think the impacts of colonialism and general structural racism in Canada have created a situation that's very abnormal. It's a shift to natural resource management that supports traditional food systems. We really need to find balance in the way that we're relating to our Mother Earth and find a way to fix that fundamentally. So this is something that is deeply ingrained in many communities, that idea that if you need food, then you should have food.
Hi, welcome to our podcast, The Zero Hunger Project. I'm Suman Roy,
I'm Stacey O'Neill.
and today we have an amazing person here to talk about a very important topic. So our topic today, it's called Starve the North. Is it a political decision? And we have Professor Dr. Joseph LeBlanc here with us.
Welcome. We're very happy to have you. Dr. LeBlanc is an Associate Vice President, Equity and Inclusion from Northern Ontario School of Medicine University, Vice President, Social Accountability Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada. Dr. LeBlanc is a recognized expert in Indigenous food systems and community development, as Associate Vice President of Equity and Inclusion at NOSM University, and Vice President of Social Accountability at the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada. He leads national initiatives on equity, planetary health, anti-racism, and Indigenous health in medical education. Dr. LeBlanc holds a PhD in forest sciences from Lakehead University and has received several awards, including a Top 20 Under 40 Northwestern Ontario Visionary Award. He is a proud member of unceded territory and remains actively involved in Indigenous food sovereignty work. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot. So, Dr. LeBlanc, I've known you for quite a few years now, and especially your work around the northern communities in Canada on the food security file. And as much as I would have loved to say congratulations, there is success there. There are small successes, but there is a lot more to learn and a lot more to do still in the northern community. So I would really like to know a little bit about what is the food security situation up north currently?
Yeah, it's a really complex issue. Ultimately, like you said, there are successes, and there is a very strong traditional food system that has been supporting people since time immemorial. Yeah, I think the impacts of colonialism and general structural racism in Canada have created a situation that's very abnormal, an unnatural state of being, in relation to food. And of course, all of the other factors that are playing into Canadian food system are compounding the issue. So inflation, the general sort of shift in production, as well as to globalization, as well as now, the threat of tariffs and other barriers that are going to create a situation where some of the cheaper food coming into Canada is going to change. So, it's still the highest rates of food insecurity as we want to measure them academically, but there's also, in my opinion, some of the strongest rates and strengths around the existence of sovereignty. It's not something we measure typically, but it is something that is there.
Fantastic. Now, you just mentioned cheap food, but in the north, we have rarely seen cheap food. It gets stuck in the urban population. And with the cheap food coming into this country, it's still the cost of food is enormous up north.
Prohibitive, I think the word is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now with this tariff, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, well, certainly, like we've seen across the country, a great concern over that, the inflation in general. And, I was really disappointed to see, a couple of years ago when that conversation started to hit urban centers. And we've now had a couple of communities in Ontario declare states of emergency over food insecurity. Those rates are a third of what we've been seeing in the remote north for a very long time. And so, I think that there is a significant threat at this point to further push that situation.
What's the magic wand solution?
Well, in a 10-second answer, it's a shift to natural resource management that supports traditional food systems. The solution will never come flying in on a plane. The solution will never come from, a capitalist structure that's there and oriented towards exploitation. Like they say, the tools of the oppressor are not going to end oppression, right? And so, in short, the answer does lie in a philosophical and then practical shift to the way that we plan for and manage natural resource systems. The idea of, for example, planning for the number of moose that need to be in a certain place to, feed a number of people is a very different approach than how we currently manage moose populations and tag systems in Ontario, which is very much for recreational or user in that way. So, there's all kinds of examples. We can look at forest and freshwater systems, but then going into other areas around, ocean systems and places where, we really need to find balance in the way that we're relating to our Mother Earth and find a way to fix that sort of fundamentally. So, yeah, I mean, other than that, we can keep subsidizing food going in. We can keep building structures within the current system. I personally believe there is some pathway in the idea of the construct of public food or food as commons, and how we then sort of bring that into a series of programs and support structures that strengthen that. So, we have all kinds of examples of food as commons. Like I said, the forests and the freshwaters are one, but looking at things like good food boxes that are supporting people, in various communities, alternate markets and sliding scale markets, the market greens kind of idea that's out there. All of these are examples of public food, even to the point of like the grocery rebate, right? Like we had at one point a federal recognition that the cost of food needed support, and then we have a grocery rebate, which is almost fits the bill exactly of public food, right? So I think the seed is there. I think that we can make some significant change for food access and food security within that market space. It can only go so far in the Indigenous and Northern communities, and that's where we have to have this view of a mosaic of food systems as opposed to just an agri-food system in Canada, right? We need to manage our forests and freshwaters as food systems, and we currently don't do that.
I mean, that's the question that comes to the forefront of my mind when I listen to you talk about this, is that you're having to fix a problem inside of a much larger problem, which is just how everything is operating in Indigenous communities and in the North in this country in general. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? Because you sort of have to fix a little from column A before you can get anything fixed in column B. How do you stay motivated to do that when it feels like you're coming up against insurmountable odds?
I think about this teaching that was shared from Archie, who's a knowledge keeper in this work we were doing in remote First Nations, and we were talking around river, right? And I was feeling, I was a lot younger. Had energy, but feeling overwhelmed by racism and colonialism and all these big structures in Canada. So the idea that like a raging river feels powerful and like you can't stop it, right? But when you throw a small rock, there is a change. It's not that visible on the top, but as you get, stronger and more strategic and understanding where rocks need to be thrown in that river, getting stronger yourself, working together with other, rock throwers to start to throw boulders, you start to actually see the change in that river. And, so we've seen that in our work. We currently have an initiative called the Nourishing Health Education Coalition, which is a whole other large conversation, but it is a space for a lot of our food actionist folks to sort of receive that support. We have a plan that makes sense, it has large systemic divisions within that, but we know where to throw rocks, being stronger to throw, ultimately, like, colonialism took generations to get us in this place. And it's going to take time, but, we can change that flow of that river. And, where there is opportunity, like, for example, the current crisis in the global economic system, this is an opportunity for Canada to act,
Absolutely. Dr. LeBlanc, you mentioned a few minutes ago about moose tags. Some of our audience sitting in downtown Toronto or any other place around the world, they would be listening to this and saying, what is a moose tag? Now, that connecting back to the food sovereignty out in North, which you also alluded to, that is doing pretty well. Can you tell us a little bit about the food sovereignty that you are seeing advancing up North, and a little bit about the food there?
Yeah, and I think this is where those systems clash, right? So that there are existing Indigenous and articulated treaty rights that some hunters can hunt under. And then there's a tag-based system that comes for all the other licensed hunters from the Crown. And so, literally the Crown in this sort of very powerful but figurative space that is permitting certain people to hunt. So there is a tag system that allocates to individuals who are, without Indigenous and treaty rights. And right now, all Ontario does is manage for these hunters without an understanding of how many loose or what is happening in this rights-based system that is exists for access for food, right? The other system is very much built around essentially like a tourist or recreational economy, right? So as to say that
it's a moneymaker, though, isn't it?
I think in conflict generally with natural law, in the way that they'll license, for example, like the harvesting of calves, right? And, that's something that and cows, right? So the female moose, and that's something that, is contrary to the way that, we would be harvesting for sustainability and food. So that's a whole other conversation which I'm happy to have at some point.
We're on like 3 extra conversations at this point of things. These are all things that need to be talked about.
And there's others than me that should speak to some of these things. And it is a very complex intersection. But why I'm saying this then is that when this is just one threat to sustainable livelihood harvesting, there are other threats around forest management, for example, decisions to spray glyphosate or decisions to harvest in particular ways that also reduce moose habitat and therefore moose populations. And that dynamic of pressure bounces between. That's kind of what I'm referring to. But what I have seen working is people caring for each other. This is something that is deeply ingrained in many communities, that idea that, if you need food, then you should have food, right? So whether that's through Healthy Babies programs, providing good food boxes to new mothers, or communities setting up traditional harvesting structures, whatever that is. It could be volunteers, it could be people hired by the community, it could be youth training programs, but then getting that food to elders or getting that food into food bank kind of models, right? So Nulge One Tag Health Center, for example, they have the Harvest to Share program where, communities are being engaged in the training and harvesting of foods. And then some of that goes to the household, some of that goes into programming. They have an amazing mobile trailer. It's all stainless steel and they can go and process and demonstrate. So you see these things happening that are rooted in that basic concept of mutual care, right? And love, and those teachings that are, I think, lost when we get into larger conversations around things like food prescribing. Like, we don't need somebody in the middle, like a doctor, in a system where there's very few doctors to verify that this person, is at threat of diabetes or is an elder and needs some help with food, right? And so we see that happening, and that interchange, that sharing, trading, these are the things that underpin that sustainable system that still exists.
And also removing the barriers between the people receiving the food and where the food originally comes from. Just depoliticizing that. I'd be interested to know, what are the types of foods that are consumed by Indigenous populations that you can't get a tag for? Are there any foods that are off limits by people who are recreational hunters or anything like that? Like, is there anything?
It depends where you're talking about. Like, there's no pan-Indigenous like food system. I don't speak for Indigenous peoples. My experience is that Indigenous food systems are hyper local food systems. So whatever is available to be in relation with, there are some products that become more marketable. And ultimately, when I sit with students and we have this same question at the beginning, I like to start with that. What are Indigenous foods and what do you know? We start, of course, people say like the Three Sisters, because they've heard that prominently, right? And they've heard that in places where that, but the list ends up being very similar to the foods that we generally see in society, like berries, right? The fish, wild rice, like these are like, I guess, sort of like interestingly othered when it is politically advantageous, but ultimately, are things that all people eat and often are like functional foods, right? So they have more than a nutritional value. So, fish that has omega-3s, yes, proteins, but, blueberries with antioxidants or cranberries with antioxidants. So once you sort of make this list, you end up seeing like, okay, there's a lot of superfoods on this list that we would use the term now, right? And so it's a really fascinating question, and I love delving into it with students because they have that aha moment of like, oh, well, yeah, like I eat Indigenous foods all the time.
Yeah. And in fact, if you go to Whole Foods, those Indigenous foods are incredibly expensive, and they've got cachet because they're, and this is food that Indigenous populations take from the earth every day and feeding their bodies unprocessed food. The politicization of food is a really interesting topic that I think should be talked about more, particularly when it comes to Indigenous populations.
Absolutely.
I'm going back quite a few years when I could walk up to a grocery store out in Toronto and get a big jug of orange juice for $3.99 or $2.99. And I've seen pictures, I don't know if it's from you or from whoever, that in Indigenous communities, that same jug of orange juice was $19.99 or somewhere around there.
$40.
Yeah. Now, right now in Toronto, I can't go to any grocery store and get a juice jug for $3.99 anymore. It's probably $6.99. But keeping that in mind, as the prices in the Indigenous communities or in the North has gone up significantly as well?
Yeah. And so I think the most recent report you can look for came from the Suluk First Nations Health Authority. They launched it about last fall sometime. And yeah, it's not something that's sort of like monitored in the same way that Ontario health units do it, which is really good. They have that sort of food basket idea, but there isn't the same like annual monitoring. So you can look at older reports, but like you said, like food costing has increased significantly everywhere. And so, it has kept pace. I would say that the SLIFNA report, and it is something that is, like I said, in the back of a lot of people's minds, in the forefront of families' minds, I'm sure, that are having to shop in these places because it is prohibitive to health. And what we've shown in the past is that there is a incentivization of low quality, high shelf life produce. And so, that's your potatoes, onions, apples, carrots, oranges, things that sit for a long time and don't require intensive care. That's the trend that we'll see expand, as well as that the vendor actually makes a lot of decisions for people when they're the only store in town or in the only store in the community. So, the decisions on what they bring on the shelves then dictates what people can access. And so we do see an overrepresentation of those low value, high shelf life produce items already.
Hi, Dr. LeBlanc. We are just going to interrupt you for a few minutes as we are wrapping up this episode. But all of you do not go away too far, because next week, Dr. LeBlanc is going to be back. And we're going to continue this conversation, because this is such a topic
It's
that we
fascinating.
cannot stop in just one episode.
And I also think it's a really important topic. And I think it deserves to have as much time as it
100%.
needs.
100%.
Yeah.
So please subscribe and follow us, because next week we're going to be back and continue this conversation.